In September 2020, The Economist, with its cover, labeled the theme Petrostate versus Electrostate, US versus China. As recently as June this year, the New York Times wrote about a race to power the future and exclaimed that China is pulling away, whilst just in the past few weeks, Bloomberg has been discussing and highlighting a trip that a bunch of Western VC firms took to understand the Chinese energy industry, the new industries, the battery, the solar, and so on. And in that article, the Western VC guys conclude that no longer can they invest in Western battery cell manufacturers. No longer can they invest in these industries in the West because China is pulling away. And energy, of course, is a really critical factor when you're thinking about global economic dominance, the rise and the ascent to hegemonic power. Cheap energy is key to a successful manufacturing and exporting economy. So my guest today is an expert on this. That's what I want to dig into. This whole idea of who's going to have global energy dominance. Is it Trump, as he claims, with more fossil fuels? Or is it what China's up to, dominating many of these new industries, these new green energy industries? So let me introduce Chris Rathke, CIO, Managing Director and founder of his own fund that he set up in 2009. The company founded in 2005, the fund trading since 2009, a solar and sustainable energy fund based out of Singapore. He's an expert on global energy dominance. He's an expert on what's going on in China in these fields. And he's of the view that China's going to win. So let's get into it. Let me introduce the guest and then I'll bring him on. His background is really multifaceted. He's worked in many parts of the world, from Germany through to Taiwan, Tokyo, in Malaysia, and now, of course, he's been based in Singapore for the last 15, 20 years. So Chris Rathke, let's bring him into the conversation. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. And let us know in the comments. Please share, and let us know what you think of this and whether you want more of this kind of stuff. So here we go. Chris, it's fantastic to have you on the podcast. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say in this conversation. I've obviously got bits and pieces of it from our prior discussions, but tell me, let's start with more of your background. Tell me more about yourself, your career, and how you got to where you are today and what you're up to at the moment.
Okay, well, I set up this company, Arcane Capital Advisors, in Singapore 20 years ago. And prior to that, I had worked in Asia for 20 years, starting in the 80s in Japan, where I had moved as a student and then got some jobs in the finance industry during this financial boom, the bubble economy. Working for a British brokerage firm in the research department, then for UBS as a fund manager. Then finally, I felt I had had enough of Japan. I grew quite pessimistic on the outlook. I thought I would probably never see a new high on the Nikkei in my own lifetime again. So I decided to move on, and I grew more interested in China. But there was not that much to do in China in those days. They didn't have financial markets, nothing to speak of. So I moved to Taiwan and learned a bit of Mandarin and had a job there. The company I worked for, the Peregrine, they went bankrupt during the Asian crisis. So in between, I moved to Germany for a few years, working there in fund management. And then came back to Malaysia, working for an ex-Soros manager in Kuala Lumpur for a while, and finally decided to go independent, set up my own shop in Singapore. And that was probably good timing. The Ministry of Finance was very supportive to newcomers in those days. Now it's getting a bit tougher.
What year was that? What year was that you set up the shop?
That was in 2005. And I had to decide, though, as a small investment boutique, I needed to focus on something. I had to specialize. I could not really compete with the big league banks and their fund offerings. So I decided to look more closely at renewable energy, which was then already quite hot and topical in Europe. But I felt very intrigued by the potential in Asia, and particularly in China. In those days, we had a lot of IPOs from Western companies, US companies. But in Singapore, we had a few who came here, and then I spent like 2 months traveling around in China, visiting all the big players with another solar analyst from CLSA. And then I decided I had to launch my own fund focusing on this Asian renewable story because there was no competition there. Nobody else did this. And my contrarian thesis at the time was that all these Western companies who entered the game would go bankrupt because the Chinese would undercut them about 30, 40% on cost. Plus, eventually, China would become the most important end market for these products. They had the fastest growing energy demand. And it was quite obvious that this would continue for a few decades. What was less obvious then was how fast renewables would become cost competitive in China, because China was completely coal-centric then, right? And
Yep.
my thesis was that the exponential cost declines in solar would fairly quickly bring us down to a level where renewables, first wind, but then solar, would become quite competitive in China. And we have reached this threshold now.
So just to clarify, before we get into all that detail, so the fund you launched is the Solar and Sustainable Energy Fund, and that was in 2009? Is that correct?
Exactly. When I moved here, set up my own company, I first had some advisory mandates doing China. One focus of my work was China, the other was renewables, and then these two things somehow merged. China became the most important driver for the energy transition.
And so you've been running that fund for 16 years.
Yes, since 2009.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, and it's been quite a roller coaster. Solar turned out to be a very difficult investment. A lot of people got caught in the hype, and then most companies went bankrupt. So I learned to somehow manage those cycles. You have boom-bust cycles in solar, CapEx cycles. When profit margins are good, companies rush in and build new factories, and then you get too much of it. Then prices collapse, there are overcapacities, and then the whole thing turns around. Then you have the next growth spurt, and they return to profitability. So we are at that stage now. We had like a bit of a bubble during the Green Deal mania there in Europe and America around 2000, 2001. Then overcapacities again, and big losses now. And usually the best time to buy this sector is when the industry is in deficit, when there's consolidation. A lot of companies went bankrupt, and they stop building new plants, and then usually you can ride the next cycle. I believe that is imminent. In China, the new 5-year plan is starting next year, and there will be a lot new demand coming.
Well, let's come on to that, because I wanted to say that all respect to you, because I've seen the performance of your fund, and as you say, it is volatile, of course, but it's a very volatile sector, and we know that when China gets a hold of something, they like to build supply very aggressively. But your performance of your fund relative to benchmarks is remarkably impressive. I mean, I know there's a lot of volatility in it, but it's certainly a considerable outperformance over your 15 years, 16 years in the game.
Yeah, maybe some of it was luck, but some of it was my investment thesis. So at the beginning, I decided the Western companies in that space most of them would exit it or go bankrupt. I mean, that was correct. What I underestimated was the ability of the Chinese to harm themselves in cutthroat competition. So that came a bit. I mean, the extent of it I found quite stunning. So we had a bust up around 2011, where most of the Chinese companies actually also went bankrupt, and that took us down. But then I learned a bit from that. So I watched very carefully the CapEx cycle. And the next time, around 2020, I was far more cautious, although it was difficult since the interest rates rose from 0.5% to 5% in the US. That really put a lot of pressure on the whole space. So I learned to live a bit with those cycles, and we managed to eke out a fairly good return averaged over this whole period, whereas we don't benchmark ourselves against any other indices because the renewable energy indices are not very good. They are poorly constructed. Most of them don't contain much or any Chinese companies, so that somehow misses the whole purpose since they are dominant now. We didn't benchmark ourselves, but if you compare us to a peer group, so I calculated the average of all these indices and ETFs and competitor funds out there. Yes, compared against them, we had a massive outperformance, 300% plus.
Well, remarkably impressive, and it is volatile, as you say. But and of course, it's not. It sort of is, but it isn't really a commodity. It's more a new technology. But I think the way the industry behaves, perhaps with China coming in and producing so much supply, you get these commodity-like behavior, don't you? So you get a lot of volatility, a lot of boom and bust.
By commodity, I don't mean raw materials. I mean more like products like semiconductors. They are in DRAM.
I was more talking about. It was more an observation I was making about the way the fund and the market can behave, because you get these boom bust. It was more a comment on that. That of course in the commodity space prices rally hard and then they go bust hard, and you see a lot of that. But and you've managed those cycles very well. I realize it's been challenging, but as I said,
it was not perfect. It was not perfect. In retrospect, I would have done
something. No fund manager's perfect. But anyway, so tell us more about, you started to touch on how you got into solar, sort of going back 20 years or so. Tell us more about why you ended up in that space.
What I found really intriguing, so around the time I managed China mandates, and there was a lot going on, obviously, in China. But then there were a lot of IPOs from Chinese solar manufacturers. And I began to study the historical learning curve, so the exponential cost declines. For every doubling of the output, you get a 20% decline in the cost of solar modules. And at the time, solar was a tiny little bit of the global energy mix. If you look at primary energy, it was maybe 0.001%. This was a rounding error. And a lot of people were dismissive about it and said, well, even if it grows a lot, this won't really move the needle. But I looked at the exponential side of it, and it's easy to underestimate the impact of exponential growth. If something grows like 30% compound over 20 years, eventually it will take over everything. So this 0.0 something tiny little bit today, if you look at it from the electricity, the share in the electricity mix, it's around 10%, 9-10%. In Europe and some countries, a lot more, like Spain, 30%. In the UK, it's I think 7-8% already. In China, at 10%. So that is electricity. But then if you look at it in the context of total energy, including all fuels, it's already 3% now. That's a fairly big slice, and it's growing exponentially. So if you extrapolate this 15, 20 years into the future, solar will most certainly account for the bulk of global energy, 50, 60, perhaps even 70%. If you make these long forecasts, of course, there's a lot of forecasting error. It's hard to see how the other variables will perform. Wind could also continue to play a big role in some parts of the world. Maybe we get something of a nuclear renaissance. I doubt it very much. It's just too expensive. It takes too long to build. And some hydro will be there, obviously, in places where, like China or in Brazil, where you have it. But the bulk of it, I believe, is destined to be solar energy, and it will be the cheapest energy source we have. In China, it's already
Yes.
It's already in the best location, and we can discuss this maybe in more depth later. It's less than 2 cents, which is really amazing. We are approaching where solar is virtually cost-free.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I was going to say, presumably the main driver and assumption, and we're putting up that chart that shows the world energy consumption that we've just been showing that you've been talking about.
I put in this little, if I may just add something, I put in this little 3% where we stand today in terms of the share of primary energy. Because the new energy secretary, Chris Wright in the US, recently came out and he made a bet against Elon Musk. He said, look, this is ridiculous. 3% doesn't contribute a lot. And he bet that it will be still the same in 20 years.
Yes. So that's interesting. So, and that's a fascinating, and I'm looking forward to getting into the US-China debate. But just to add to this chart that we're showing, so just to understand the driver of your forecast, what you're really saying is the primary driver is your view that the cost of solar is going to fall. Has already fallen dramatically and will continue to do so. And of course, all the other energy sources, we have a rough idea what they cost. They've been around for a long time, most of them. So in that sense, it's not that hard to make those sort of ambitious forecasts that you've made. I mean, is that correct? That it's really a relative cost game?
But what is quite astonishing about this whole thing, I mean, the people who are critical of the energy transition, they dismissed it and said there is actually no transition. We are just stacking a little bit of renewables on top of the existing energy system, which is still fossil fuel based. So that's the line of argument, for example, by Chris Wright, the energy secretary in the US. But we have reached a tipping point here where actually renewables begin to disrupt the traditional energy system. And once you're 7 years ago, I was in Saudi Arabia and I told these people we are approaching something of an event horizon. Once you are beyond this point, there's no return. Then this thing will disrupt your whole energy system. And they found this quite astonishing, but now 7 years later, we see this happening. So we used to stack renewables on top of fossil fuels, and now renewables are beginning to replace and disrupt the traditional energy sector.
It's a fascinating comment, and I guess your Saudi comment makes the point, does it? Are they not investing in a lot of solar themselves?
No. Now, when I first went there was nothing. Now it's massive. They scale up renewables extremely fast. I told them, and I mean the people in the industry knew it, of course. I told them they generate most of their power from oil and gas. But the cost of gas, even if you get your fuel feedstock for free, is still about 7 cents because the capex is quite high and you need water. You need water for the turbines, and the water comes from desalination plants. That water again requires a lot of electricity to make. So there is no cheaper alternative. Solar, by comparison, costs about 2 cents in the Middle East in good locations. So it's 60-70% less than gas or oil.
And presumably the Chinese are selling most of their solar panels.
Everything. Now, in those days, we had one issue with renewables, though, which curbed their growth. Which, what do you do if there's no sun? Energy storage in those days, 7 years ago, was still prohibitively expensive. So if it costs you, let's say, 5 cents to generate the electricity, then it would have cost you another 20 cents to store it. And that would have undone all the benefits, the economic benefits of solar. But over the last 10 years, we have observed a similar exponential cost decline for batteries as we previously witnessed for solar. It's down at 90% in just a few years. And I remember the first lithium-ion batteries hit the market when I worked in Japan in 1991 for UBS. I remember some of my colleagues there, they had bought the first Sony these cameras with lithium-ion batteries. They were the first consumer products with lithium-ion batteries. And I went back, I calculated what the cost for those batteries was then, adjusting it for the energy density and everything. And since then, the cost has fallen 99%.
Wow.
So now you can actually store, and some of my friends in Germany are doing this. They had solar rooftop systems they bought years ago. Now they are retrofitting it with batteries. They can store a day's need electricity for maybe an additional 5 to 10 cents a kilowatt. So if producing the electricity on their roof costs maybe 10 cents, you add another 10 cents, you are still it's still 30% lower what you have to pay the utility.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? And this technology gets better and better. And of course, as you say, China dominates in these industries, which is kind of fascinating. So let's get on to the main thrust of the topic, which is this idea of this sort of battle for energy dominance, the sort of, as you describe it, or as the economists described it, petrostate versus electrostate. Get us into that one, because you alluded a little bit to Chris Wright, the US Energy Secretary, just now. It's a big theme, and I think it's, of course, it's a huge, as an economist, it's a huge theme. Who gets the cheapest energy? Because, of course, it feeds into your economy and your industrial sector in such an important way. So give us the background, give us your thinking, give us the reasons why you think, you talked about Chinese electricity, 2 cents per kilowatt hour. I think America's going for 4 or 5, and poor old Britain's sort of lost in the back at, I don't know what it is, 14 or 15. But give us an overview of that theme and get us into that theme. That would be great.
Well, right at the beginning of this new Trump presidency, we had this bizarre proclamation of an energy emergency, right? He came out, oh gosh, we have to open up more land for drilling, and otherwise we will lose the game. That was so bizarre, so strange, because there was actually no shortage of oil, and even after the Russian invasion, gas prices spiked up tenfold in Europe, but only a little bit in the US and came back. So I mean, what energy emergency, and during Trump's first term, actually, America had turned around and turned from a net importer and an exporter because of the shale boom. And a lot of money was to be made in this industry, although there was a boom-bust cycle. And then we had Biden, and renewables were all of a sudden in a stronger competitive situation. And that's when the oil and gas industry got really worried, and so they supported Trump, his re-election, in order to survive, because they had to prevent this thing, renewables, from scaling up. Meanwhile, for America, it's easy to get carried away, to get misled by the fact that America has this huge endowment of hydrocarbons, in particular shale gas. So in the Appalachian gas fields, I think at the best of them, they have a break-even price of about $2 per million BTU, and that translates into roughly $10, $12 oil. So that's amazingly cheap energy. However, in order to benefit from this, you also need to build the grid and the power plants. So the idea was, since America needs a lot more power now, the demand for electricity had been fairly stable in the prior 10 years. Now they have to ramp it up, and it's just not possible to do it, because if you order a gas turbine nowadays, it takes, the lead time is about 5, 6, 7 years. And now they are stuck and tied up in a lot of contradictions. They would like to boost cheap energy supply in the US for the consumers. But what they get is a spike in electricity prices because they had not prepared for this Maganomics. The idea is that you reindustrialize America, but that requires a lot of power. For example, a couple of decades ago, you had 30 aluminum smelters in America, and they covered most of the domestic demand. Now there are only 3 left, and they're extremely energy hungry. So in order to bring some of that back, and that's the whole purpose of the tariffs, you would have to build the equivalent of 10, 20 nuclear power plants. And that is not possible, and therefore you need to have gas power. But the gas power you can get because the manufacturers of gas turbines are sold out for the next 5 years. So, America is entering like an energy crisis, which in some ways looks similar to the 1970s under President Nixon.
Yes, and I think you had a slide on that, didn't you? That we can
And-
put up
and-
now on the electricity prices in America. Yeah.
So there's an acute shortage now of electricity in the US market, and there's no prospect of this getting easily resolved. We have no solutions.
So is just to ask on that, because obviously people see a lot of these sort of outages in California of electricity and in other parts of the country. Is that to do with the grid or demand, or is that to do just the whole structural setup of the energy market in terms of delivery and so on and transmission? What's going on there, do you think?
It's all of the above. I mean, it's like the perfect storm. It's the result of like a decade of neglect. The grid is one huge issue. It's so difficult to build a few 100 miles of high voltage lines with the permitting process. It takes forever. There's a lot of NIMBYism. And then on the supply, the supply chain, you need things like transformers, which are hard to get. Most of there are a few million of those in the US, and most of them are old, 30, 40 years old. They would need to get replaced. And there's just no manufacturing base for these transformers. So I think the other day, Elon Musk announced that he would enter the manufacturing of transformers, which was quite surprising. So this, for example, is one thing, and it's difficult to get the permits. And then, yes, getting gas turbines is also difficult. So America has lost its industrial base, which would be required for all of these things to scale up. And the manufacturing of gas turbines, for example, doesn't scale well. There are a lot of critical materials that go in, super alloys. You need titanium, nickel and stuff. Most of it America imports. And if you slap huge tariffs on all of this stuff, and by the way, there are also some rare earths. You need this yttrium, I think. China is the main supplier. If you slap tariffs on all of this stuff, the cost will double, and that's what it has done. Gas turbines, I think, they cost almost twice as much as 10 years ago, and they take forever to order.
So really, from the point of view of the US, they've turned away from renewables under Trump, going for the sort of the petrostate, the gas, and all those kind of, but the supply chain to deliver all the stuff you need and upgrade the grid and the transport, the whole supply chain just isn't there and isn't going to happen quickly. So the move to a petrostate. So you would contrast that with what China's been up to in the last sort of 5-10 years, which you would describe, I think, as an electrostate, or The Economist described it as that.
Yeah, so the Chinese turned their weakness into a strength. They were quite shrewd about this. 10 years ago, Xi Jinping, he came out with this master plan, China 2025, and he put a very strong emphasis there on the build out of renewables, electric cars. He had the right vision. He saw that maybe China could leapfrog the West and the energy suppliers in the Middle East by switching to domestic supplies of renewables. That was a very smart move, and they've performed amazingly in the car industry, for example, which is now not only the biggest in the world, they are also the largest. In the last few days, they've turned in the largest exporter of cars, many of them being electric cars. So they have the right vision. And the Chinese, there's this fellow, Dan Wang, who recently has published a book contrasting the engineering state in China. Most of the leadership in China have backgrounds in engineering. It's like a must-have, a degree, engineering, whatever. Even Xi Jinping, in his early days, he got into biofuels and stuff. So the Chinese, they know a lot about energy from a strategic point of view, and they hate to be dependent on anyone for energy. That's a huge threat. There's a lot of concern about China maybe invading Taiwan, but that seems highly unlikely because the Americans could just switch off their oil supplies. The Strait of Malacca here in Singapore, if no oil goes through, that's it. In 2 months, the Chinese will run out of oil. So I don't believe that will happen. And so it all fits together. So renewables strategically are promised to offer a low-cost solution, which would give China a competitive edge, not just for domestic demand, also as an export industry. And it would give energy security, independence. So it all somehow fitted together. In America, we got somehow lost in the interest politics there. There was a very powerful fossil fuel lobby. And so you had competing interests there. Even under Obama, this was quite visible. You, as a US politician, you always had to pay lip service to the interests of the fossil fuel industry. And they are doing really stupid things like biofuels, production of ethanol, which has to be blended into gasoline. It's such a wasteful form of agriculture that you could, on the same amount of land where you grow corn for ethanol, you could produce 100 times more energy for solar.
Right, with the panels, if you put panels out there, right?
Yes, panels or wind farms, and that's why, for example, in Texas, a lot of farmers also have wind turbines on their ranches, and the fossil fuel industry lobbied very hard to stop that, to shut down new connections of wind power to the grid, but they failed because there was too much opposition from the locals. They wanted to have their renewables. So Texas is the biggest player now in renewables, even though it's Republican.
Yeah, that's extraordinary, isn't it? But so in a sense, you got America sort of traveling the other way, trying to reduce its amount of renewables, kickstart, and having all these challenges as well, planning and NIMBYism and so on. But in China, of course, it's in the plan. to do this, and when China decides to do something, it generally happens. So maybe talk a bit about how China got everything to be so cheap. Because as I understand it, your expectation is that Chinese electricity will go to 2 cents per kilowatt versus what America at best might get to 4 or 5 over time. Is that correct? And the rest of Europe much higher. So talk to us
Well,
how what is it they've done that's managed to deliver such cheap electricity?
Well, when I started looking at this technology in the early 2000s, there was already a well-established learning curve, a historical one, from the 70s, where you could see a steady cost declines for solar. But in those days, there was no professional manufacturing of solar. It was all very extremely small scale, special use case like satellites. Cost was no consideration. But then in the 90s, the Japanese entered the manufacturing of solar cells, and they, for the first time, applied mass manufacturing techniques. And so they brought down the cost by 50%. And then in the early 2000s, we had the Europeans and the Chinese enter the game. And the Chinese really made the big difference. There was such huge scale. And they cut costs across the board. When I first went to China, most of the capital equipment, the machines needed for making solar wafers and cells and modules, wet chemical processing and diffusion furnaces, most of this stuff was from Europe, and it was quite expensive. And now the Chinese have completely localized this equipment, and the cost has come down 80%. So they brought down the feedstock material, the costs, polysilicon, the equipment, and they improved the technology. They filed like thousands of patents. The Chinese now dominate research and development. There's huge competition. Once you start doing something in China, the cost inevitably will fall in manufacturing because there's such insane competition. It looks from the outside, it looks like a monolithic, huge monster, but inside China, you have all these provinces competing with their champions against each other. So they also try to kill each other.
Yes.
So it's an amazing form of capitalism. I just read a book by Kenneth Rogoff about the US dollar, our dollar-year problem. And interestingly, in the book, he recalls an episode from the 50s, 1950s and 60s, where America felt quite threatened by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union in those days was growing so fast that it looked like they would overtake the United States. That was almost conventional wisdom then. But then they lost it because they didn't have this domestic market with this huge competition. There was no consumer market. And China here somehow in these things brings together the best of communism and the best of capitalism somehow. It's very strange, but it seems to work.
Well, it does. It certainly does work, but there's certainly a lot of issues with it as well.
Oh yeah. And there's massive capital destruction since they go completely overboard in these things. I remember during the last bust up in 2010, 2011, when a lot of solar manufacturers went bankrupt in China, I calculated that they had destroyed some $100 billion in capital.
Yeah, so there's huge misallocation of capital, which is part of the reason why it's very difficult for them to open their capital account. And there's also the risk of capital flight because people want to diversify away from the authoritarian regime. But yes, your point is well made. And I think you have a chart of the dawn of the solar age, which I think is the right one to put up, that shows the fall in the costs of the installed solar and also wind, and the fall in the cost of the electricity in China as a result, which I think is that the correct one I should be putting up now? Is that correct? Because I think that's a a
Is that
fascinating
the
chart,
one with
which
the economy cover from 2024? Well,
dawn of the
finally,
solar age, slide 13 in your pack,
oh, okay.
which is a fascinating pack.
Okay, yeah, yes. Those are some of the cost declines that have been
Yeah,
recorded by IRENA, but you see similar surveys from different groups in the United States. I mean, it's still going down exponentially. We had a bit of an increase because of the tariffs in the US. Basically, the tariffs there, they add about 200% to the cost of a made in China solar module.
in America, is
Yeah,
that right?
yeah,
Right? Yes. Okay.
yeah. And
So these
still,
arena costs, this is what China's selling it on the world stage for, or in the world markets, or is this what is
well,
this
in
is
China, they have their own price, which is actually not that different from what they export to the rest of Asia or Europe. We had some tariffs on Chinese manufacturers in Europe, but they finally reached the end of their lifetime. So they decided after 10 years they would lift those tariffs. It made no sense because there was no manufacturing left of solar in Europe.
yeah,
So now it costs about a solar cell. When I started looking at this sector, which cost maybe $4 per watt, it now costs less than 10 cents.
yeah,
Uh,
incredible,
and
incredible.
it really, they worked. I mean, they worked extremely hard to improve the technology.
Yeah,
And so the processing is now far more efficient for all these precursor products, and the intermediate processing, the metallization of solar cells, everything is so much more efficient. And the throughput rate of a fab is like, it's like 3-4 times more than what it used to be 15 years ago.
yeah, it
It's
is
enormous. Um,
quite impressive. And I just wanted to add as well, whilst you're talking about that, it would be great to put up
and
the
plus they had an industry cluster there in several regions in the Pearl River Delta around Shanghai and one up in the north. There were a couple of clusters where you have a lot of consumables in the manufacturing of solar cells, chemicals and whatever. It's a lot of stuff is required. And this became so huge and competitive, it's impossible to replicate this in any other part of the world. I remember a couple of years ago, the Saudis dreamt about bringing some solar manufacturing there. No chance. They would never be able to compete. They would have to subsidize it. Maybe they could do that.
Well, it's interesting what you say because, of course, you know, if one looks at the charts of China's share of global exports, they've been going up ever since their application to join the WTO in 1995,
Yeah,
followed by their joining in 2001, and
yeah.
their share is the highest in the world by far now, and it's the only one that's really gone up. So that kind of emphasizes your point and emphasizes the importance of cheap
Well,
energy
it's
to keep that
also
industrial base going. But let me just add one chart from your pack on slide 9, because that kind of makes the point. Slide 9, in fact, slide 10. China dominates with the 3 news, as you call it, which is this sort of their share of
well.
global EV and global battery cells.
Well, this is an interesting way. Chinese propaganda, they like to have these maxims, right? Formulas, and often it's 3 somethings, the 3 evils, or the 3 represents, things like that.
Right.
This is partly in the language. In Chinese, they love to have these combinations, these
Yeah.
3 sums of. And yeah, so of course it's a lot more than 3 news there. It's, if you look at the whole manufacturing cluster, it's more like 20 or 30 different things. But he liked to bring it down to an easy to understand formula to rally the masses behind
Right.
his
Right.
campaign. So that was really
Hence,
smart. And the outcome, if you look at the chart, is stunning. They took over the whole
yeah.
industry.
Incredible. I mean, absolutely incredible. And that was also emphasized in that New York Times article I mentioned
Yes.
in the introduction that you and I have discussed before, and so on and so forth. So all of this makes me think. So China's heading towards cheap electricity. A lot of it's already there. What would the skeptics say? What would the pushback? What pushback do you get to this thesis when you talk to people around the world? You mentioned Chris Wright sort of being dismissive, the US Energy Secretary, but when you talk to other sort of specialists in this field, what is it that worries them about the ability to China to achieve this? What might go wrong, or what are the risk factors here?
Well, I mean, China has arrived. They've already achieved it. That's hard to take away from them. But what is a bit worrying is the whole context in which this boom is taking place. China is clearly a mercantilist trader. They promote exports and they enforce or incentivize high savings and a lot of investment. And on this website, Our World in Data, there are some fascinating charts that show, compare this with other countries in history. And the share of consumption in China seems absurdly low. It's 45%. That's not a very healthy situation. So I experienced a similar situation when I was in Japan in the 80s. Ronald Reagan and the US got really upset about these trade surpluses Japan had with them. And they finally forced a revaluation of the yen, which was very painful for Japan. And they also forced the Japanese manufacturer to come over to set up shop in the US. So Tesla's new factory in Fremont actually was originally a joint venture with Toyota. So clearly what China is doing here, they account for what, 35% of global manufacturing value added. And if you extrapolate this trend, we go to 50% by the early next decade. I mean, that would be insane. That would mean China exports unemployment in the rest of the world. It's mercantilism, plain and simple. So that is not good, and I think the Chinese understand this because they're also hurting the global South. It's not that only the Americans are getting upset about this; it's also hurting the Europeans. Their car industry is getting wiped out now, and it's hurting emerging economies like Indonesia and Thailand. All the local manufacturing they had is squeezed out by the Chinese. So the China is, despite this export boom, is actually experiencing a crisis. They are stuck in a structural crisis. There's not enough sufficient domestic demand. And the situation has gotten worse now because they had a property bubble which peaked in 2021. And now that prices are down, depending where you are, and 20, 30% or more, and second-tier cities, it's probably even worse. I mean, that has a negative wealth effect, which makes it even more difficult to stimulate domestic consumer spending, right? So that is a negative, but on the other hand, that really makes me feel quite positive on my energy transition theme, because one of the few sectors left where they can actually make a big difference is by electrifying the whole economy, going electric. Electrifying road transportation, switching in many industrial sectors to heat pumps, new processes, electrolysis, even steel may go totally, the manufacturing may turn completely electric within 15 years. And building the grid, of course, that's also very capital intensive. China has earmarked an astonishing $800 billion for grid infrastructure over the next 5 years. That's as much as Europe and the US combined, I think. And they built 10 times as many high voltage lines a year than the United States, and at a much lower cost. So this is all beneficial, or I mean, at least it will help to address the issue of global warming, climate change to some extent, because China was the biggest emitter of CO2 clearly in the world. Everyone moved their factories to China, and the energy powering those plants was largely coal, 60, 70%. Now it's down to 50%, and I believe over the next 5 years, they will bring it down to 20, 30%. Already most coal power plants in China are loss-making. They make no economic sense. They require subsidies.
That's very interesting. So, I mean, I get the idea that the sort of new energy industries are going to be good for China. But coming back to the point about China structurally, and and I know you spent a lot of time looking at China in general, and I don't think you describe yourself as an economist, which is, of course, what I am. But the idea that you're going to transition to a consumption-led economy in China just doesn't seem plausible at the moment. There doesn't seem to be an impulse within the leadership of China to do that. I mean, would you say that's a correct observation? I mean, how are they going to get over all these structural problems you mentioned? They're too big for the world. They need more domestic demand, basically.
Yeah, they need it, and I think they would just love to have it, but they find it very hard to figure out how to do this without giving the power monopoly of the Communist Party.
Don't you need a welfare state? Isn't that in the sense that you need some retirement provision, so people can they can feel that in their retirement they don't need to save their whole life to make sure that they're not abandoned. I mean, that's one of the reasons the savings ratio is so high in the household sector, which of course feeds the investment side. But if you got to the place where people felt there was some provision in retirement, there was some safety net, you may well get the savings rate come down and drive some more consumption strength. I mean, that's possible. I mean, the issue is on demographics, of course. You've got the wrong demographic profile for China. So I mean, do you see any of those issues being thought about by the leadership or addressed in any way, other than the odd subsidy to buy a new washing machine that we sort of see here and there, but nothing very serious is our sense?
No, I think they understand all these issues very well. But it's just not that easy to find a solution, because I mean, China is already highly indebted, as you know. Its total debt stands somewhere at 300% of GDP. I mean, the central government doesn't maybe hold much of the debt, but the local governments, a lot of it is hidden. And how do you fund then a welfare state? One positive aspect about China is that healthcare and a lot of things are so much cheaper than in the West and in the US. If you go to a dentist or something, it costs you a small fraction, or if you require surgery, it costs much less. So that could help. But boosting consumption overall during a time when they've hit peak population, puts them in a similar situation like Japan, right?
Yeah.
So
who've struggled for 20, 30 years,
yeah. So I think it will be difficult, but they will try it. I think they will try a lot of things. The energy transition is one, but obviously they will also look how they can improve the welfare state.
Do you hear any noises that they're trying to do that? I mean, I haven't really.
No, not really. But I don't follow this topic close enough. I don't know out of my depth there.
Yeah. Let me ask you one other quick question before we sort of come into land. How does this leave Europe? Because of course, Europe's industrial base has come under a lot of pressure from China over the last 10, 15, 20 years. But Europe has embraced alternative energy. And at some stage, surely in Europe, energy is going to get a lot cheaper. I know it's not there at the moment because they're subsidizing everything, but they are building the infrastructure. And if the battery technology is truly as good as it's supposed to be or going to be, then surely Europe will be able to deliver quite cheap energy going forwards. Is that correct, or is it?
No,
Where would
no,
you see Europe in this?
Absolutely. I think people are way too pessimistic there about the energy situation. The initial cost of those subsidies were, of course, prohibitive. They overspent, they oversubsidized the sector, especially in Germany, but also a bit in the UK with wind power offshore. But the grid has to be, the design of the grid has to be reformed to make it more efficient. So for example, in the UK last year, I read in the FT, 13% of the wind power was wasted. It couldn't be fed into there was a surplus.
We have these stories of people being paid to turn things off because the grid can't cope, which is in the UK, which is really quite frustrating.
Yeah, and in Germany we have similar issues with the so-called Dunkelflaute. So what do you do if you have no wind and no sun? We have this special word in German, Dunkelflaute. Dunkel means dark, doldrum, and no dark, and Flaute means doldrum. So there's no wind. And a lot of is the failure of our political system, really. I mean, we have enough backup power. We have a reserve power, legacy coal power, it's still there, but it was not used. Instead, they switched to nuclear power from France or hydropower from Norway, driving up the prices there and really driving people there mad. So a lot of it is the result of poor planning and politicians. For example, to integrate a bigger share of renewables into our system, we need smart meters to incentivize people to use less during times when there's less availability, and to incentivize them to use more when there's too much. But for that, you need these smart meters. And I remember 10, 15 years ago under Angela Merkel, they promised us we would get in a few years smart meters. We still don't have them. So
in Germany, yeah.
In Germany, it's very frustrating for my friends. Some of them, they would like to fill their batteries, charge them at night when there's cheap off-peak electricity, wind power. But they don't have the meters to program the charging process. In Italy, most households have those meters already. In China, you have smart meters everywhere. So it will take a few more years, I think, for all these things to get sorted out. But obviously, Europe will forever remain high cost. We just built one high voltage line from the north to the south, Südlink. It took forever, like 2 decades. It was, and at the end, the cost was prohibitive. I calculated it cost more than 10 times what an equivalent line would cost in China.
It's all the planning issues and all that sort of stuff, I guess, basically, that holds it back.
Yeah, we are, we have all kinds of issues in Europe also with the work ethic. The Germans are the world champions in sick leave. They take 1 or 2 months off a year. In China, obviously, you don't have that. I don't know. I mean, our living standards probably will go down in future because of demographics and the debt situation. On the positive side, I believe the Chinese will move more of their manufacturing bases to Europe. Car manufacturing.
Why? Because of the way the politics, basically. Is that what you're thinking, or?
Because of tariffs. So it will be similar to what happened in the United States in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, where they convinced the Japanese to come over and produce their cars there. That's the only reason why the American car industry survived.
Interesting. So that is fascinating. So let's wrap it up and conclude. And I don't know if there's any sort of final comments you want to make. I mean, I think the whole topic is utterly fascinating. The cost of energy in different parts of the world, and thank you for the way you've articulated. I think there's one slide just worth throwing up as you're thinking about your thoughts. You mentioned the world's biggest solar plants, and I think what is it? There's one that's already big enough to power Britain. Is that the Midong? Is that the one that?
No, Midong is currently still, it holds the record of the world's largest, and it went into operation, was commissioned last year. And it's 5 gigawatt. That's absolutely huge. That's DC. So AC, it's a bit less. It's 3.5. But this is in Xinjiang, so a very sunny region of China where land costs nothing, very arid. And they started building it in 21 when solar panel price was still quite high because of the Green Deal, and the cost of interest was much higher. Interest rates in China, which are now below 2%, then we're at 5. And still, I calculate that the cost of electricity from that plant is about 2 cents a kilowatt, which is incredibly cheap. But now they're building a few more of these, much larger, like 10x larger, and they will benefit from extremely cheap solar panels now and solar inverters, and the financing cost is much less. So I calculate the cost for those new plants coming up could be as low as 1 cent or somewhere between
1 cent.
I mean, you get virtually cost-free electricity. And once you have that, then it's easy actually to electrify a lot of traditional industries.
And just to give a sense, so you mentioned 3.5 DC AC in terms of gigawatts. The gigawatt capacity of the UK is what, 50, 60, 70 gigawatts or something?
About that.
So the new one they're building, which is 10x Midong, is basically...
yes, but you have a much bigger economy. Plus, you have to adjust these numbers for solar because they are not base load. They only run about 4 or 5 hours a day. So you need a lot of capacity also to store energy when it's needed, for when it's needed. But still, I mean, the scale is just astonishing. When I started looking at the industry 20 years ago, worldwide, we produced about 1 gigawatt worth of solar modules a year, or installed that kind of amount of solar panels, 1 gigawatt. China today produces and installs this every day, every single day.
Every day. Yeah.
So so we are moving towards the terawatt hour level of global installations. Currently, we see a huge upspike in Africa and the global south. Countries where you had little electricity, all of a sudden the Chinese are moving in and they're building the infrastructure, and even places which are off grid all of a sudden have access to power. It's pretty amazing.
So that is amazing.
The next 5 years, I believe there will be a boom in solar, but in Europe, the market, we are reaching the saturation point. You cannot scale it up much more.
Yeah. And so just to conclude, what's the best way to make money from this? So you run a fund, obviously, but
I currently, I think we are well placed to ride the next wave. And we also invest, we have a second fund, the Green Metal Fund, which is a Singapore registered fund. We invest in all the commodities linked to the energy transition. And currently the hottest one is silver. So there's also a precious metals angle. Manufacturing is a cyclical business. I think it's turning around, it's coming. So for the next 2 or 3 years, I'm quite bullish on that. Also wind turbines in China are incredibly cheap. Wind power is very competitive and complementary to solar. And yeah, commodities. I mean, a lot of people were very excited about copper playing the chief role in the energy transition. But if we get hit by a global recession next year, which I think is highly likely, I think we will get a setback also in commodities and copper, but that could then bring the perfect entry point.
Right.
We should continue this conversation, and maybe in a half a year or so, update what's happened in between. I think there will be a much clearer perspective on a lot of these things, which we see starting now.
Well, that would be great. That would be fantastic. I'd love to continue it. So let me just say thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts, and love the enthusiasm for the area and the knowledge. We're putting up the web address now, which your website, I believe, is being refreshed as we speak. If people need to get in,
I can send it to you later. You can also put in my email address there, just in case if someone's interested. Maybe my Twitter address. I from time to time I post, but I'm very my nastier side comes out when I'm on Twitter. I'm very polemical.
Well, great. Well, people can follow you on Twitter then to taste the nasty side. So thank you anyway, Chris. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
It was a great honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.